Our scripture reading this morning is from our assigned psalm for the day, Psalm 139. And I invite you just to kind of hear and receive this as an affirmation of the ways in which you and all of us are so fearfully and wonderfully made. From Psalm 139. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from far away. You search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, O Lord, you know it completely. You hem me in behind and before and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is so high I cannot attain it, for it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my parents' womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. I want to start with just a word to you, Jess. Frankly, I think it's pretty audacious to get baptized right now. And Jess and Colin, pretty audacious to baptize May today. And I give all of you who are here today credit for just showing up to church this week, for making time and finding the energy and navigating whatever challenges have to be navigated in your life to show up to Zoom church, even if it's also true that you don't have to wear pants or brush your teeth first. I give you credit for believing that there might just be something happening here that's worth your time, your labor, your resources, for believing that there is a God that does not sanction the doing of violence, the elevation of whiteness, or the endangering of so many of us in this community and our precious, beautiful siblings. I give you credit for showing up to church on a day when our national denomination, the United Church of Christ, one of our denominations, is warning us that churches like ours are targets for this kind of hate, which we already know because we have experienced it in a spiritually and psychologically violent Zoom intrusion. We know that faith communities that dare to proclaim the gospel of justice, of love, and of transformation and condemn white supremacy, condemn transphobia and misogyny, and condemn the exploitation of our sacred earth, puts them at risk. There ain't no neutral in a time like this. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a privileged, educated white German pastor who could have laid low, if not benefit, from the Nazi stronghold and the Holocaust, put it this way: silence in the face of evil itself is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. Bonhoeffer risked his life attempting to end Hitler's maniacal and genocidal reign of terror, and he was put to death as a result. So I give you credit for coming this morning, whether it's your first time or you've been part of this community for decades. I give you credit for saying yes in the way that you just did to Jess and May and Colin, for making a commitment to folks you've never probably had the opportunity to meet in person. I give you credit for coming to a church that may be clear about our values, but also has real work to do when it comes to how we live out those values in the midst of a pandemic and an uprising, and figure out what it means to be sanctuary, and build a more just and equitable structure here in our church at this time. Our nation is in a deep spiritual crisis. When the body is poisoned or broken, that poison will make its way through the system. The vulnerable spots will reveal this first, the canary in the coal mine, so to speak. It happens in our own bodies. When we get sick, the weakest and most vulnerable parts of our bodies show symptoms and experience the pain first. We all have those weak spots, right? And it happens in the same way in the body politic. It happens in our church. It happens in our families. It happens in our nation. The most vulnerable folk feel the impacts first. Then those experiencing some vulnerability, and then the parts of the body and the parts of community that have been up to now the most secure, the most able to keep living more or less unscathed despite state-sanctioned violence or poverty, AIDS or COVID or insurrection or brutality. Our body is in crisis. Our national body is in crisis, and we're all feeling it. And we need to remember that we will not all feel it in the same way. Some of us are reeling from the events of the last week and the last 4 years, shocked and dismayed and maybe even unmoored at what we've witnessed. Some of us have been living in that state of fear and risk and victimization and white body supremacy and transphobia and poverty and ableism our whole lives. Some of us and our ancestors know something about white mob violence. Antonio Gramsci, an Italian philosopher who was imprisoned under the fascist dictatorship of Mussolini in the early 1900s, wrote, "The old is dying. The new is struggling to be born. Now is the time of monsters." Now is the time of monsters. I witnessed this in South Africa as apartheid was crumbling and the racist regime knew their days were numbered. But like bullies who couldn't bear not getting their way, even when they knew their time was up, at the last minute they threw every conceivable resource into creating a level of chaos and violence that was almost unimaginable. If we can't have it, we'll destroy it so you can't either. If you're evicting us, we're going to burn it all down so there's nothing left anyway. After Mozambique, a beautiful country which sits at the northeastern tip of South Africa, liberated themselves from Portuguese colonization, the Portuguese were so bitter that before they pulled out of the capital, Maputo, they literally poured concrete into the city's pipes, destroying the infrastructure of the entire city. If we can't have it, we'll destroy it so you can't either. Now is the time of monsters. And in our case, these monsters are waving Jesus flags and praying before they bring their nooses or pipe bombs to our nation's capital. What we're witnessing and what's been part of the very fabric of this country for centuries is Christian nationalism and Christian supremacy. Christian nationalism perversely merges Christian and American identities, distorting both Christian faith and American constitutional democracy. It demands that white Christians be privileged by the state and that their freedom and prosperity be enshrined and ensured by any means necessary. And related, Christian supremacy is a belief and practice through laws and policies and cultural frameworks that we are a Christian nation, blessed above every other nation by God. It's what you might describe as the connective tissue among different systems of domination that use the language and capital and power of Christianity to seek their ends. And it provides incredible cover for white nationalists, racial subjugation, and religious discrimination. Experts are warning that we're facing a wave of right-wing Christian nationalist legislation this year. Elected officials across the country are poised to bring forward a flood of bills that would eviscerate LGBTQ and reproductive rights, force religion into the classroom, prevent trans folk from accessing bathrooms and using their own names and accessing health care, and prevent queer couples from adopting children. These are all generated by highly funded, deep-pocketed Christian lobbying organizations which craft and plant this legislation across the country. So if you thought you could relax after Wednesday, I'd argue that we need to stay alert. Just this week, the Iowa Senate introduced a bill which would out transgender youth, requiring school districts to notify parents of trans students who wish to be identified just by their correct pronouns. This puts thousands of students at risk of abuse and neglect and suicide. This and legislation like it is infused with Christian supremacy, white supremacy, and packaged as patriotic. In a sermon entitled "The False God of Nationalism," preached in 1953, Martin Luther King Jr. argued that God and nationalism are incompatible and wrote, One cannot worship the false god of nationalism and the God of Christianity at the same time. I don't know about you, but for me, it's pretty challenging to be part of the Christian faith right now. Sometimes it's hard to even be associated with a tradition and institution that has been used to do harm, when there's so much potential for healing, for liberation, and for reimagining life together. Which takes me back to where I began. Choosing to be baptized in the midst of this madness and this moment is amazing. An act of downright resistance, and maybe exactly what our faith calls us to. So, Jess, you are our teacher today. To choose this faith in this church at this time, when you could have done this anywhere else or nowhere at all, is for me a reminder of the power of baptism, the power of belonging, the power of our Christian tradition, which reaches back into Jewish practices of using water for purification, commitment, solidarity, and a scriptural tradition in which people express their resistance to empire and their devotion to community and spirit through baptism. Thank you for modeling for us this morning what resistance can look like. To Jess and Colin for modeling what resistance can look like when we baptize a child. For modeling what faithfulness and courage can look like. For modeling what belonging can look like. And inviting us all to lean into our belonging, not just to you and May and Colin, but to each other, to God, to this sacred earth, and to a broken world so in need of healing. It's such a powerful symbol on a day when we're honoring the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his own legacy of resistance and faithfulness and vision. When people are baptized, they're asked questions of themselves or on behalf of their children. Today, Jess was asked, do you accept the freedom that God gives you to grow in love and community and to resist injustice and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves? To this and more, she answered, yes. Baptism is about saying yes. Yes to God, to conspiring, yes to conspiring in the liberation of the most vulnerable, yes to co-creating a world where justice and love drive our choices. It's about saying yes to this church, this scrappy, struggling, powerful community. It's also about saying no. No to empire, to domination. No to letting others co-opt our faith out of greed and profit and fear and violence. It's about saying no to the false god of nationalism that King warned us about. You may have had a little bit of a sense of this, but when we are gathered to do a baptism in person in the church, one of the highlights, at least for me, is the flinging of water from the font onto all of us in the room. And Kip kind of symbolically did that without compromising his devices. We invite one another as we spray water all over to remember our baptism. And I can feel Kyoko all the way in Japan flinching now, because every time we do this, I see her face blanch because she's afraid we're going to send a sturdy stream of water right onto our beautiful grand piano. We try to avoid that. But when we do that, when we fling water on one another, not just because it's fun, not just because it's dramatic, but because it reminds us in the sprinkling and the giving and the receiving of water that we're not just celebrating the one who's being baptized. We're also recommitting ourselves to standing with them, but we're recommitting ourselves to our own baptismal vows for those of us who have been baptized. We urge one another to remember your baptism. And so today I invite those of you who have been baptized to remember your baptism. And those of you who have been, to remember those baptismal vows that you made or that were made on your behalf. And for anyone who's not been baptized, I invite you to notice or remember your own faith or spirituality or moral conviction and what it means for you now, and how those things are informing your own yeses and your own nos. So to close this morning, I want to invite all of you, if you would like, to respond in the chat to these two questions. What are you saying yes to this week or at this point in your life? What are you saying yes to? And where are you giving a hard no? Out of your own spiritual and moral convictions, out of a sense of your own baptismal vows, what are you saying yes to? And what are you saying no to? I'll give us a minute for people to put some of those in the chat. I'll read them out loud. What's your yes? And what's your no? Yes to reaching. No to breaching. What's your yes? And what's your no? Yes to joy. Yes to modeling these values to our children through choices we make and the way we live our lives and those we lift up and support. Yes to staying in the moment, in the present. No to advertisers on the alt-right media. No to fear. Yes to hope. No to disconnection. Yes to self-love. No to fear. Yes to family trying to maintain connection in spite of not being able to go anywhere. Yes to walking. No to feeling less than. Yes to being open to new ideas. No to being stifled by fear. Yes to growth and no to fear. Yes to using my voice when and where it is needed. Yes to hope and exploring options. No to fear. Yes to gratitude. No to self-pity. Yes to messiness and imperfection. No to walking away from discomfort. Yes to love, hope, and gentleness. No to hate, aggression, and fear. These yeses, these no's, this baptism, this belonging, all of this is God's good news. Amen.